Is capitalism inherently racist? Angela Davis thinks so.
Yeah, racism is integrally linked to capitalism, and I think it's a mistake to assume that we can combat racism by leaving capitalism in place.
Activists and leaders have taken racial justice one step further, demanding an end to capitalism. And many Black liberation thinkers have been critical of capitalism, like W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, and Huey P. Newton.
You got to freeze capitalism, Nixon! Freeze capitalism! That's the problem! That's the problem!
So, what does racism have to do with our economic system? First, we have to define what capitalism even is. It's an economic system in which private individuals and corporations control the means of production, aka the resources and tools used to generate wealth. And as the system evolved with time, those who had been enslaved or serfs now worked for wages. But those wages never equaled the value of the goods they produced, which is how the owners who made the profits kept growing their wealth. But COVID-19 is bringing the US economy to its knees. At least 14 million people lost their jobs between February and May of 2020 due to coronavirus.
So what we're seeing is that the pandemic has really brought to the surface that people are doing much, much worse than is being projected. And this is obviously falling along racial, class, and regional lines. Those who are racialized as Black are suffering at a disproportionate rate or a different rate because of economic and structural factors.
She's right. Fewer than 1 in 5 Black people have a job where they can work from home, increasing the likelihood of contracting the virus. Black Americans are almost 4 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID-19 than white people.
Even in a moment of sort of national crisis, the police violence, the state violence has not abated. And I think that has really incited some radicalism in people.
Black people are disproportionately dying at the hands of police and because of health disparities.
The demand for the end to capitalism is an understanding that this system of economic exploitation and subjection is really at the root of these forms of racialized state violence and state-sanctioned savagery and killing.
So, how did we get here? Well, through a forcible process Karl Marx called primitive accumulation, where a monetary surplus was created by enslaved people who were paid nothing. Basically, slavery was the American economy's startup money. In the 60 years leading up to the Civil War, the amount of daily cotton picked by enslaved Black people increased by 400%. This stolen wealth made millionaires out of white plantation owners and helped propel the US as a leader in the global economy. And even MLK said, the fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor.
The U.S. has always had to contend with this contradiction of what I would call value minus worth, right? That Black people produce an immense amount of value for the economy through super exploitation, expropriation, and dispossession. So there's an economic function that Blackness performs. But then the worthlessness piece is like the U.S. has to conceal that, right? In order to rationalize repression and domination, there has to be all of this legitimating architecture about Black folks as criminal and lazy and rapist and disposable. And so it's this contradiction, right, that I think has structured the U.S. economy.
This is a concept called racial capitalism, coined by Cedric J. Robinson. It's a form of capitalism where racism and commodification of non-white people are at its core. World War II, which devastated Europe's economies but left the US mainland untouched, turned the US into the world's major capitalist power. This acceleration of capitalism started to generate resistance among working people, including intellectuals. They advocated and pushed for an alternative to capitalism, which, keep in mind, used profit as a way to organize the economy. This alternative was socialism. In case you're wondering what socialism actually means, it advocates for public rather than private ownership of the means of creating wealth and a more equitable distribution of that wealth. Although societies ruled by communist parties like the Soviet Union supposedly practiced socialist economies, their systems were also brutally authoritarian, which is why the communist model is rejected by those who proclaim themselves democratic socialists.
Because insofar as accumulation, capitalist accumulation is based on racial hierarchy, socialism threatens to upend that both the economic and the racial order.
Anti-communist sentiment was cultivated in the US as a way to preserve the status quo of capitalism.
So there's this idea on the one hand that socialism is fundamentally incompatible with both Western man and with the United States. And to me, that has to do with its potential to influence and incite rebellion among racialized people, specifically Black people.
In the US, advocates for Black civil rights were often persecuted as being sympathetic to socialism or the USSR, a practice known as red baiting.
There is a way in which people who are struggling for civil rights were pressured to disassociate themselves from communists or people who have more radical politics and focus on very narrow demands on the state for recognition by the state that foreclose a much more robust political, economic project of liberation.
One example was in 1955, when civil rights activist Paul Robeson was denied a U.S. passport because of his sympathetic views toward the USSR and because he was an avowed socialist.
And so they're deemed communist, but what's equally dangerous about them is the fact that they are promoting racial equality and, better working conditions and egalitarian participation in society for workers.
Red baiting was also a feature of COINTELPRO. That's the FBI's counterintelligence program designed to surveil, infiltrate, discredit, and sabotage political movements the US government felt were so-called subversive.
We see this transform in the 1960s and 1970s into COINTELPRO and the systematic targeting of Black liberation groups like the Black Panther Party, like the Revolutionary Action Movement, who again are taking up these demands for self-determination for Black studies on campuses. These are considered to be red plots. The Black student unions are they're infiltrated by FBI workers.
Despite all these efforts, anti-capitalism sentiment in the US is still growing in today's movements.
Socialism is having a moment in American politics right now, and that's freaking a lot of people out.
And if you look at the stats, it's not a surprise. For example, the number of billionaires in the United States has more than doubled since 2008. And in the past 30 years, the wealth of US billionaires increased over 1,000%. That's more than 200 times greater than the increase of US median wealth over the same period. This rising economic inequality is hitting Black Americans especially hard. Before the pandemic in 2016, the net worth of white families was 10 times more than that of Black families. And during the pandemic in May 2020, the Black unemployment rate hit 16.8%. That's the highest in almost a decade. These realities are leading people to demand socialist policies, like canceling rent, improving food assistance, and expanding universal health care.
We need help. We need a ban on evictions. We need help with our mortgages and our rents.
Now, some believe that racism can be overcome and wealth can be created if only more capitalist opportunity is provided for Black people. That's where concepts like Black capitalism come in. This is the belief that wealth can be generated in the Black community through Black entrepreneurship, Black ownership, and business. But here's the thing, Black capitalism is still operating within the framework of capitalism. This means that any wealth it generates in Black communities won't be owned by those communities. That wealth will be in the hands of a few rich individuals from those communities. This is why some activists push back on the idea that racial and economic inequality can be ended by simply seeking diversity within a capitalist system that is inherently unequal.
It looks as if the system cannot reform itself. We've tried Black faces in high places. Too often our Black politicians, professional class, middle class, become too accommodated to the capitalist economy.
So what happens next?
Critiques of capitalism are happening on the ground. Efforts to build alternatives to capitalism are happening right now, whether it's through sharing economies, whether it's through mutual aid. These are efforts and visions at something else that's possible. People who have been historically subjected to racialization, colonialism, and imperialism deserve the right to determine their own destinies